Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Renée Vaugeois. I'm with the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, and we're here up in Treaty 6 in Edmonton, Alberta. So I just want to welcome everyone onto the call this morning. And so just to preface the session, the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, along with Immigrants Alberta and the Alberta Workers Association for Research and Education, we came together over the last year and really made an effort to engage with diverse Albertans from all the way up north to Fort McMurray down to Lethbridge. And these Albertans, there was over 80 Albertans that kind of participated in coming together and talking about like what was important for them in terms of the provincial election that passed, but also this upcoming federal election. So we really worked with these folks to kind of hear their concerns and then translate and turn this into a bit of a people's agenda and the calls to action. Marco, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the people's agenda is basically an effort of different sectors in the community, and I'm not sure if everyone have the copy of our agenda, but it really attempted to highlight those individuals and groups that's mostly asking to be heard. You know, from like Renee said, from the north to Lethbridge, southern Alberta, and we did this in a span of a few months. And then we have put together the agenda that we are hoping, you know, to engage with you know, with the community, but also with politicians, with candidates, and so on.
Hang them out to dry.
So, thank you, Marco. And so today our hope was to have the chance to talk about like environment and foreign policy, particularly, and I appreciate the patience with us as we delayed from the call last week when it was during the climate rally. So, you know, considering what's the recent reporting that's been happening at the United Nations, as well as this like global movement of young people, I think it's a really interesting and relevant topic for us to be talking about for the federal election. And I think both Marco and I would agree that I feel like, you know, Canada's foreign policy is really fundamentally tied to our conversations about the environment and kind of ensuring our future. So we're excited to have Greg Hession from the People's Party of Canada from Foothills, Alberta, join us on today, as well as Kelly Lorenz. I hope I said that right, Kelly. From the People's Party of Canada, Calgary Nose Hill. We did have some other candidates, but they have not joined on the call. So we're just going to go with it. And I'm actually looking forward to the conversation. I think, Kelly, before you came on, we were talking about this need to kind of engage with the PPC party and build some bridges. So we're really excited to have you here. We did make the effort to kind of reach out to every candidate for this, and we're really trying to make sure we had a broad kind of representation. We do have PPC involved in all the town halls coming up, which is really great. So just a reminder that we're recording and we're going to post this online when we're done. And just like a final piece before we jump in is like we were able to do this work, and I just want to acknowledge the support of the Catherine Donnelly Foundation and the Government of Canada, the Anti-Racism Program. So just to start off, before we kind of jump into the topics of environment and foreign policy, I thought maybe it would just be nice to have the chance to introduce ourselves a little bit more. So for, you know, Kelly and Greg, I was hoping maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what made you want to run for the federal election. You know, why is it important for you? And then Marco and I will just kind of give a more of a bit of an introduction of ourselves as well. So I'll just quickly start. And as I said, I'm up here in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. I work with the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights. And our mandate is really to promote conversations and dialogue and learning about human rights and how they're relevant to our communities in Alberta. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, looking forward to this election. It's a really interesting election to observe, as I feel like the dynamics of our political culture in Canada has been changing, and it's interesting to observe. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'll pass over to you, Marco, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Marco Luciano. I am an immigrant here in Canada, and been working with migrant community for the last 20 years, doing a lot of advocacy work, and have established an organization called Migrante along with other migrant organization. And in 2013, we established shop here in Alberta, pretty much addressing the issue of migrant workers, temporary foreign workers, and many of them fall into the cracks of immigration. So we address those issues, but also we all tie that to human rights, and basic human rights of mobility, being able to migrate under the, freely, right? So that's my work. I've been doing that for the last 25 years. Also engaged in labor and labor unions. But those are the work that I have been doing. And Migrante is trying to really advocate doing a lot of advocacy work on permanent residency, right, upon arrival. We see that if Canada really have a gap in the labor market, then separating families are not the way to go. It is bringing them here and making them feel like a Canadian, be like a Canadian, like anybody else.
Awesome, thanks, Marco. So, Greg, how about I pass it over to you to introduce yourself and kind of what brought you to running for the federal election this time?
My name is Greg Hession, PPC candidate, Foothills, Alberta. I have a background in engineering from the University of Ottawa, third-year electrical apprentice, certified blockchain professional. My interest in the People's Party of Canada is a result of many years of research and investigation into politics, not only in Canada, but internationally. And understanding that what we're facing here in Canada is a situation where the government of Canada has evolved into an engine of dominance, where it's truly actually not representing the needs of the people that it's intended to serve. Rather, the government has evolved into somewhat of a beast that seeks to only enrich and empower itself and those that operate within the system. So the People's Party of Canada in our platform represents a political strategy that serves as an antidote to this corruption, to really restore the power of government to the people the way that the founding fathers of the country intended it to be. And this is something that's not only important for Canadians who have been here for many generations, but also for new Canadians coming to Canada, need to understand what is happening politically in Canada, because they're going to be living here and raising their families here. And what has happened with the collusion between government and media is providing a disservice to all Canadians, new and old. So we really are representing a political revolution in Canada, and our platform stands on truth, based on 4 pillars of freedom, respect, fairness, and personal responsibility. So we want to instill these values into the hearts and minds of all Canadians. And it was the platform and Max's bravery and courage that really drew me to the party. So I became a founding member and responded to the call for candidacy, won the nomination back in June of this year.
Thanks so much, Greg. And how about Kelly? I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kelly Lorenz. I am the People's Party of Canada candidate in Calgary, Nose Hill. My background is I'm a veteran, so I spent time with the Special Service Force here in Canada. I recently completed 10 years of service with the federal corrections, working at all levels of federal corrections, so maximum, medium, and minimum security. I'm a crisis negotiator within federal corrections, so I bring extensive knowledge when it comes to gang issues, firearm issues, the opioid crisis. And I understand. I have a good understanding of the mental health needs that Canadians need, and which were severely lacking. And for me, joining the People's Party was about exactly that. It was about fighting for Canadians, all Canadians. I've done that for the last 20 years of my life, and when you speak about immigration and bringing immigrants to Canada, I fully encourage that, and I fully support the fact that Canada was built on immigration and immigrants. But one of the things, and I've seen it firsthand, is that when we bring the people from overseas to Canada, rather than just bringing them here and setting them up and say, here you go, we're setting them up to fail. And to me, it's important that when people come to Canada, they're coming here to support a dream, to support a lifestyle. A lot of the people that I've talked to have said that, I believe in what it is to be Canadian, and I encourage that. I support that. 3/4 of my team right now are all immigrants. So I have a very diverse team, and so that's what drew me to the People's Party. We draw a lot of criticism for a lot of different things, but when you look at the individuals that are running for the People's Party of Canada, and when you look at our platforms, it's really difficult to understand why the name calling or the racism and stuff like that is being projected at us when you actually take a moment to look and read what we have to offer and who exactly is running as candidates within our party.
Interesting. I think we're going to have I think we're going to have a fascinating conversation today. You both have a really interesting backgrounds and quite diverse backgrounds. So Marco, can I throw it over to you to start the discussion about environment and foreign policy?
For sure. I think to start with, it would be awesome to hear both of your thoughts on the agenda item, and that's specifically on the environment and foreign policy. What are your thoughts on it? And how would that, how do you carry that in your campaign?
Do you want me to just kind of review them quickly before we jump in?
For sure.
Does that help everybody? So some of the things that we heard going through this was, so some people, when we talked about the issues, some of the issues were, the issues around some of the language that's being used, and this idea that the language of illegal and temporary and foreign, how it's unhelpful, but also this frustration that people who come over to Canada, who come over with really great credentials, can't get into the fields that they need to get into. So for example, there was a woman in Calgary who, she's a doctor, but she cannot get into her profession here, even though she passes all the requirements. But then there's also this piece about Canada's role in the world in terms of our mining companies and how they are maybe contributing to displacement of people overseas, and how that's an important thing to think about. So some of the calls to action that came around foreign policy and immigration came to things like our CPP investments, and how do we ensure that those investments are ethical and not contributing to more challenges around human rights. Talked about kind of that accreditation pathway for people who come as professionals, and so that they can practice back home, and addressing those gaps in the labor market. And then in terms of the environment, one of the biggest things that people really wanted to focus the conversation on was this piece about how do we really need to transition. Like, we can, even if people even really love the Alberta oil sands as many do care and worry about that, how do we balance this need of transitioning to a just kind of energy use and in Alberta? So those were kind of some of the big issues that came up in the agenda. So I'll just kind of throw it, I don't know, Kelly or Greg, if either of you feel called to go first, but even to just share your thoughts and perspectives. Sorry.
Go ahead, Greg.
Okay.
Okay. Well, addressing the displacement of people internationally because of Canadian mining involvements overseas, I'd like to point out that what we've seen in Canada is the flight of capital out of the energy and natural resources sector. So the government of Canada is imposing regulations that are not friendly to business, and that's driving money out of Canada. When government imposes regulations that restrict economic development, that money goes and it finds another jurisdiction that's more friendly to operate in. So it's known as Gresham's Law. Good money gets flushed out, bad money comes in. So if we are concerned about Canadian mining companies' involvements in jurisdictions around the world displacing people, then what I would suggest we need to do is address the topic more fundamentally, where the government of Canada should be responsible for creating conditions that are conducive to economic growth here in Canada, where we have an excellent history of environmentalism and human rights when it comes to working conditions and safety standards and so on. What we're seeing is, with the flight of capital out of Canada, is unemployment, and that results in higher crime and substance abuse and the disintegration of families and communities. So it's all based on the economy. We have to have a strong economy if we're going to have a strong nation. Mm-hmm. What was the second or the later part of your question?
And that was the piece around that transition, the transition.
Oh, the transition. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, there's a lot of focus on the transition. That focus is rooted in the narrative that carbon dioxide is a driver for climate change, which is a false narrative. So I've studied the climate and researched climate science for many years with a background in science, previous experience in the gas and oil industry, and 12 years in the renewable energy industry. I felt as though it's incumbent on me to understand the science that the future of the industries are being based upon. As a scientist and mathematician, we have a saying, garbage in equals garbage out. And if your government is basing policy on erroneous or faulty science, the outcomes are not going to be good. So when people start to realize this, and people are realizing this, it's evident just to the casual observer, where in Calgary and places in southern Alberta last year, we had water and sewer lines freeze for the first time ever. That does not correlate with the narrative that an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere contributes to global warming. And what the media and government are not doing is they're not doing a very good job educating the people in what the other natural variations of climate change are. And there are many. It has very little to do with carbon dioxide, and it has much more to do with the sun, with the magnetosphere, with our position within the universe and the galaxy and the interstellar medium, and all these other factors that nobody talks about. Mm-hmm. And as a scientist, it's very frustrating. The amount of money that is being put into the disinformation complex that is contributing to the disintegration of our society is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, if not over $1 trillion. And if we'd only taken all those resources and all that effort and all that energy into things that are actually going to make a difference as the climate changes, because I'm not denying that the climate is changing. It's clear to me that the climate is changing. But reducing our consumption of fossil fuels and curtailing our natural resource sectors here in Canada is the exact opposite of what we as Canadians should be doing, because ultimately, at the end of the day, Everybody needs to have food in their mouth and a warm place to sleep. And if people are going to be being displaced, then we need to focus on housing, and we need to focus on securitizing our food industry. That means propping up agriculture through the promotion of greenhouses and animal shelters and grain storage and other types of research into agriculture that are going to ensure that we have a stable food supply for generations to come. You look at what's happening in jurisdictions like China and Russia, where they are halting their corn exports this year, and Russia has put $90 billion into an initiative to construct greenhouses. It's because they're not following the popular narrative of Western culture that carbon dioxide is driving climate change and they need to curtail the consumption of fossil fuels. Rather, what they're doing is they're saying, okay, climate change is real. We got to keep food on the table for everybody. Let's put our resources to work and securitize our food, because that's ultimately what matters. Canada has a $700 million a year trade imbalance with the United States of America for the importation of fruits and vegetables. So there's a $700 million industry that's just waiting to be stood up here in Canada and supported by initiatives from the government. But we're seeing nothing like that. All we're seeing from government is a boot on the throat of the economy. And at the same time, they want to bring in 350,000 people a year to a country that does not have an energy security situation. We're not secure in our food resources. We're the 12th highest consumer of hydrocarbons out of any country on the planet, and somehow they think that's going to fight climate change. It's absurd. It's a mockery of our intelligence, and it needs to stop. And the People's Party of Canada is the only political party that is speaking the truth and taking a position that is diametrically opposed to what I refer to as the 4 dead horses in the race to the bottom. People need to wake up, and we need to be smart about how we're going to go about doing things. So I thank you very much for allowing us the platform to share that information with you.
Interesting. Okay, Kelly, I'll pass it over to you.
You know, my responses obviously are going to be slightly different than Greg, but in addressing the Canada Pension Plan and investments, it's important to understand that the Canada Pension Plan itself and the investment firm that controls these investments are supposed to be, and typically are, at arm's length from both the provincial and federal governments. So and those investments are regulated, have regulations for them through the federal government. Now, if we're going to open up those regulations just specifically for the Canada Pension Plan, then we're going to have to open up those regulations for everybody, and that becomes a challenge. Now, in understanding, I mean, in looking at your questions and that here, I do understand and I do respect the fact that, you know, we have to recognize as you put it, the destabilization of human rights violations in other countries. I absolutely agree with that. And that's where the federal government has to step in, not as from an investment portion, but as a foreign affairs minister, and recognize the fact that these atrocities are happening around the world. Yeah. I've personally experienced that in my experience with the military. In saying that, my last UN tour was in Rwanda, obviously. A huge human rights violations and the mass genocide that was happening there, and how we address those needs. When you go into the transitioning in the environment, I'll put this question to you, and maybe you know the answers to them. About who wrote the Paris Accord? Are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the people that wrote the Paris Accord themselves were Bill Nordhaus and Phil Romer, and both of these individuals received the Nobel Peace Prize for economics, not for environment. Yet we're following an economic plan on environment based off of this. So for me, that leads to that tells me this is more about money and capital than it is about the actual environment. But then, like Greg said, when you take it a step further and you go and take a look at and you read a lot of the facts, you know, carbon is the base of all life. We're all carbon based. Right now, the Earth has about 400 parts per million when it comes to plant growth, and and it's the scientists say that in order to optimize plant growth and food growth, we should actually be at 1,000 parts per million. That carbon is good. You look at the larger greenhouses. What do? They go out and they actually purchase CO2 emitters to put more carbon into their greenhouses to allow their plants and that to grow, to allow the food to grow. So do I necessarily believe that we're in a climate emergency? No. Do I believe that, you know, we need to address the issues when it comes to the environment? Absolutely. You know, that's why the People's Party is taking this a different direction. We're allowing the provinces themselves to govern themselves. If a province feels that they need to clean up their carbon footprint, then do it. And that's been shown to be, it's been proven to be, that's what's being done. Right now, Canada contributes 1.6% of the world's total emissions. That's really insignificant in nature, yet everybody's talking about, you know, a carbon tax here now in Canada, which is probably going to be one of the largest carbon taxes in the world. So we're going to have Canadians paying for a carbon footprint that doesn't meet the impact that Canadians are actually putting on the environment. You know, and that's, for me, that's a challenge. I mean, the People's Party of Canada, you know, we're focused on cleaning our rivers, cleaning our lakes, you know, cleaning our national parks up. We have Canadians right now, First Nations reserves, First Nations that don't have clean drinking water. You know, I mean, when we start addressing those issues, and you know, like Greg said, speaking the truth, then we can, you know, we can evolve as a country, and we can take those things and make things better for Canadians. Do I believe that we need to support people around the world in cleaning up our environment? Absolutely, I do. We need to address the issues, but when we're addressing issues and we're simply throwing money at it, saying to countries, "Here's some money, fix your carbon footprint," do we really believe that that money is going to cleaning up their carbon footprint? Because we don't see a noticeable decrease in their emissions, and we actually see an increase, right? So we have to recognize all of that. Getting away from fossil fuels at this point right now, you know, it's difficult. I mean, we need to take some of this money, and we need to create ways of clean energy. Right now, that technology is starting to develop, but it's not there. You know, it was identified that if we got off fossil fuels tomorrow, we would be out of trees in Canada inside of 2 years, because we would need the trees to heat our homes. You know, so yes, we have to look at other avenues. We have to look at other technologies and develop that. At this point right now, we're just not there.
Yeah, thanks for that response. I guess a follow-up question on the issue of mining and environment is that when you talk about, I think it was Greg who talks about mining and displacement solely on that context, and not perhaps you could elaborate on the role of Canadian mining corporations in the world. For example, 40% of extractive industries in Latin America are Canadian owned, and these industries are, you know, extracting mines, whether it's going to be used for our batteries for our cell phones or oil to ensure Canadian lifestyle. It is emitting extensive amount of energy and carbon that it devastates those countries, right? And I'm not talking about Canada as a country, but Canada's responsibility to environmental degradation of
Mhm.
countries of the global south. Can you please elaborate on your response around Canada's mining corporations and its role, particularly not only in displacement but also in environmental degradation?
Go ahead, Greg.
Okay. Um, well, in the sense that any mining operation that takes place in Canada is subjected to our environmental regulations and our human rights standards. It's incumbent on other countries around the world to put in place environmental regulations and human rights standards, presumably in response to what the government has agreed upon with the people of those countries. Now, again, if Canadian mining corporations are putting stakes in the ground and shovels in the ground in jurisdictions outside of Canada, I don't know how the government of Canada can be effectual in putting controls in place to uphold the same standards that we uphold here in Canada. So again, I revert back to, well, why aren't we providing conditions conducive to economic growth with our natural resource sector here in Canada, and try and bring those companies back home? If the reason is because we don't have those minerals present here in Canada and we have to go elsewhere to mine for them, then yeah, maybe this is something that needs to be looked at as a joint effort between the Canadian government and the government in which these Canadian companies are doing business in. And we can propose alternative extraction technologies to clean up the water that's being used, to make sure that we're not polluting the water, and better emission standards on the power plants and the other processes that are being used there. But yeah, it's a big problem, as you've identified, Marco, and
Yeah, it's huge. Kelly,
I don't know if I have all the solutions for it. Mm-hmm.
So having open mind. Kelly, how about you? Do you have any more reflections on that question?
I agree with what Greg said, and I agree with what the challenge that Marco identified. The problem is what we're, especially the People's Party, even here in Canada, we're looking for less government in people's lives, but we need to hold other governments or other countries accountable for the atrocities that they're, that they're going through. If they're not, protecting the environment, they're not protecting the peoples there. We have to hold them accountable, and that's a completely different. It's a completely different sort of area, right, in foreign affairs. What you're asking is to hold Canadian companies accountable for actions that happen in a foreign country, which is a whole nother set of issues, and that relates out of corporate affairs rather than foreign affairs. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do I think that we need to have a watchdog, I guess, in that sort of area? I don't know if that a watchdog would do any good, because we can't enforce the laws of the country that they're in. We would hope that Canadian countries would be ethical in the way that they mine in foreign countries, but again, how do you hold them accountable to that, other than because they're outside of the country? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting negotiation to.
It's a tough challenge, right? I mean, how do you? It comes down to more and more regulations, and more like I say, the accountability has to be on the government where this mining is taking place, to look at, to ensure that the rules and the laws that they have for that country are being followed. Holding Canadian companies to Canadian standards in foreign lands is a challenge.
That's interesting. Kelly, Marco, do you have a follow-up on that one, or?
No, actually, another question on the environment, I guess.
Go for it.
Well, as you know, December, I think mid-December is the next Conference of Parties. COP25 will be held in Chile. Since I think 2005, 2015, is it? No, 2005, Canada have committed to a certain number of reduction of emissions. I know you talk a little bit about the science behind this gas emissions. However, Canada have committed historically to globally to these conferences and ensuring that there are governments are around the world are being looked into their looking into climate change and environmental issues in their countries, including Canada. And Canada is not close to the reductions in they promise by 2020. In 2 months, it's 2020, right? Are you saying that your party will disengage in this kind of conversation with other countries in terms of environmental issues?
Go ahead, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Well, Canada has a lot of innovative technological solutions to environmental problems. But it's important that we direct those innovations and investment money in the right way, strategically, so that we're actually affecting change environmentally. Again, I revert back to the fact that carbon dioxide is a gas that is essential for life. Of all the CO2 that is in the atmosphere, only 3% of it is attributed to man. Carbon dioxide has always been in the atmosphere long before man was here, and is part of the intelligent design of our planet and our biological ecosystem that allows plants to grow through photosynthesis. This should not come as a surprise to anybody. So by trying to curb our emissions under the auspices that reducing CO2 is going to change the weather is absolutely ridiculous. When you consider that China, for the last 2 years, has been building coal-fired power generation plants at the rate of 1 a week, and this trend will continue for another 8 years. They're planning to bring online a total of like 225 gigawatts of coal-fired power generation by the year 2027. China and India are the largest emitters globally of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So why is it that there's such a focus on Canada to reduce our emissions when we're just a drop in the bucket? It makes absolutely no sense to me. So although we do seek to withdraw from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Paris Accord, this does not mean we are going to green light pollution to be allowed to be emitted into the atmosphere, into our lakes, streams, and oceans by any corporation that's seeking to do business in Canada. Quite the opposite. We are going to encourage and incentivize, through different means, corporations to maintain the highest standards of environmental emissions and environmental quality for doing business here in Canada, as we have in the past. We're world class, and we're going to uphold that position staunchly, not only in Alberta, but right across Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to understand or recognize or separate the differences between pollution and CO2 emission. But essentially what you're asking is, you're asking if Canada is going to hold foreign countries accountable for the emissions that they create. And you know, we do a lot of trading, obviously, that economically helps Canada. There is ways, in my opinion, that you can hold foreign countries accountable for their commitments to the reduction of pollution. But you know, it becomes challenging because it comes down to what's measured in the atmosphere, and how do you take those measurements and quantify it into an actual reduction. You know, it just becomes a bigger challenge every day. Do I think we need to reduce pollution? Absolutely. I think everybody would agree with that. I mean, I've talked to people that live in the cities, and you know, they look in the sky at night and they don't see the stars. As simple as that, right? And then you go into the country and it's clearer. Obviously, you see the stars, so the pollution obviously is significantly less. Accountability, you know, you can do that, but you have to ask yourself, how far are you going to push that accountability when it comes to the economic prosperity of the country? Right now, the People's Party of Canada is committed to Canada and putting Canadians first. We have to make sure that we follow at least our commitments when it comes to, you know, cleaning up the emissions that we produce as well. I think the People's Party of Canada's plan for that is effective in, like we've both said, cleaning up our lakes, our rivers, you know, and effectively having clean drinking water for Canadians. So is there an easy answer to all of this? Absolutely not. I wish there was. But you know, accountability only goes so far.
Yeah.
That's just human nature.
Interesting. Well, thanks for those feedback, those comments. I think we have another 5-6 minutes, and I wanted to kind of shift the conversation a little bit to Kelly. You kind of mentioned too at the beginning of how in some ways we're setting newcomers up to fail. So kind of shifting from our environment and having a quick conversation about newcomers, immigrants, migrants into Canada. And one of the things I know, and I've seen over my many years of work here at the center, is that in many ways we have this kind of false promise to people who come to Canada and come to practice as professionals or come here to work as migrants. And I was wondering about both of your perspectives and thoughts about how do we make a shift here? Because the piece about the fact that we have professionals driving taxi cabs, and the fact that we have people who have a lot to bring to our society, but yet they're not being used. And knowing, for example, that we have shortages of doctors in rural communities, but yet we have doctors driving taxi cabs. What are some of your thoughts about how we need to shift in relation to immigration? Any thoughts about that? I don't know if that's clear.
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, I guess it would be, you know, good for me to know the folks that are coming to Canada or who have arrived in Canada with, you know, good credentials that would, you know, allow them to work in medicine or law or technology, and they're finding that there's no jobs available for them, and they take a job that, you know, it isn't what they had in mind. What were they told ahead of time?
Sorry, Greg.
You know, like, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important to recognize that this isn't a phenomenon that's isolated to just Canada.
Yeah.
I know nurses and doctors that have gone to England, for example, and it's the level of qualifications that don't meet the standards of Canada. Just like the nurses and doctors that go over to England, they don't meet the standards there. And so you have to meet those standards. So really, it's easy to say I've come from some place and I'm a doctor, but do you meet the Canadian standards in what it takes to be a doctor? Yes, they can write the exams and they can challenge the exams, and some of them even have to go back to school for a time period to meet those standards to be a doctor. Now, in saying that, the People's Party doesn't discourage immigration, but what we're saying is, yes, we want immigration. We want less numbers, but we want those immigrants that are coming over to be able to contribute to Canada. We want them to be able to succeed, which is first and foremost. And part of that succeeding is being able to do the jobs that exactly like you said, like they're able to do, and that comes with, like they said, a credit system in showing that yes, they can do the job. Currently, what's happening right now, we have such a huge influx of immigrants, and like I said previously, we're setting them up to fail. Mm-hmm. And this is a perfect example of that. We have doctors that are here that are driving taxi cabs, and it could be as simple as getting back into school to challenge these exams and become the doctors that they in the profession that they were where they came from. University is hard enough to get into as it is. I know that. I tried for 9 years to get into a university to try to get into law school. It's difficult, and so there's those challenges as well. So I think it's just a meshing of our qualifications and understanding where those qualifications are, and it's about the meetings or the interviews that take place prior to everybody coming over. So there's no false understanding that, what, I'm a doctor and, but you don't meet the qualifications here.
I think there's a difference between meeting that quote unquote qualification in the immigration and actually being able to enter the job profession, and because many under the qualifications set out by the immigration are qualified to become engineers. So they're here as an engineer, but they cannot find a job as an engineer because there's red tape within the National Engineers Association and things like that. And those are two different things. So we are pretty much recruiting what we call quote unquote the good Canadians as opposed to a bad Canadian. And they are in Canada, but they don't even have access to the professions that they wanted to access, right? So those are two different things.
You're talking about political red tape.
I'm talking about accessing, the profession that they came to access, but they can't access it because one, they have they're able to come in as using their profession. Some nurses are here with 10 years, 20 years tenure, but they're working as live-in nannies, right? Because there's no access to those professions. That's what I'm saying. Those are two different things, right?
I'll give you a perfect example, though. I had a partner that was a nurse in England, neonatal intensive care nurse. Came to Canada, didn't meet the qualifications of a neonatal intensive care nurse. It was something completely different. The qualification was different. Had the opportunity to challenge that in school, challenge the exams, failed the exams. But that doesn't mean that she's not qualified in the country that she came from. It just means that she doesn't meet the standards here in Canada. Now, does that mean a reduction in the standards, or does that mean giving them the ability to attend school or attend college to upgrade what they currently have, and supporting that upgrade? I believe we need to support these immigrants. If their qualifications don't meet the Canadian standards, then yes, absolutely, let's support them and get them, because we have a shortage. That's why we have them coming over here. Let's encourage them to increase their education. Let's encourage them to meet the Canadian standards, and let's make it better for everybody. That's the whole point of people coming to Canada. They want to have that. I call it's like the American dream or the Canadian dream, right? They come to Canada for a reason. Why discourage them from meeting that qualification? Let's help them.
like
get to that point.
make it more accessible.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. Yeah. And I was mentioning too, there's a doctor I met this weekend who meets all the qualifications to practice medicine, but it's just these barriers of, and we're not even sure what the barriers are, and what people are told before they come is often doesn't match what happens. So it's a really convoluted mess.
People are told that it doesn't match what before they come over, because you have to look at the numbers that are coming over. Right now we have 350,000 people a year coming over. How do you interview 350,000 people and ensure that, you know, never mind security for Canada, but how do you interview those people and ensure that, you know, the qualifications that they have meet Canadian standards? Are we just giving them false hope to bring them, you know, bring these people over? You know, there's nothing worse than false hope.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we see it time and time again. I've seen it in the federal correction system. I've talked to these people. You know, we bring them here. We're hoping that they succeed. We're setting them up to fail because of their expectations differ from what we're able to provide for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we have to find that middle ground.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Well, we're coming up past 1 o'clock. I just thought maybe what we could do is just a quick closing from each of us on any kind of closing thoughts. Maybe, Greg, do you have any last closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to reflect on Kelly's statement of, you know, the dreams that people have when they're making that very difficult decision, or what I think would be a difficult decision, to leave their home country and you know, take up residence and come move to Canada. I've met many new immigrants here in Canada, and they're so happy to be here. And of course, you know, I can just imagine that, of course, you know, as soon as you get here, yeah, you're going to be happy because you made it. You know, you've packed up your stuff, you've made the move, you've got here, you're landed in Canada, things are great. But I have concerns that, you know, once the honeymoon is over, and the reality starts to set in, that, you know, they're being challenged beyond what they were thinking they were going to be faced with in terms of getting into a good job and providing for their family and so on. That's a very deflationary sentiment to carry. And, you know, maybe there's people that are thinking, oh, geez, this was a little bit of a mistake coming here. So what I would like to see is some platform that the government can put together that has a more in-depth question and answer information forum for people that are considering immigrating to Canada, where we can do a lot of pre-screening and question and answers so that we're not setting people up with false hopes. I think that's really important because Canada is a wonderful place to live and do business and raise a family. But the trends that I'm seeing right now are not leading us into a prosperous and secure future for the nation. So one of the things that I would like to be able to do within the People's Party of Canada is help support a change in those trends, so that we can be more welcoming as we have been in the past, and generous as we have been in the past. But we do need to look after Canada as a country first. And once those conditions are met, then we can possibly look at increasing our immigration numbers that the People's Party is proposing right now.
Okay, thanks so much, Greg. How about you?
Thank you.
Do you have any closing thoughts, Kelly?
You know what? I'll keep it real short. I know Greg, I agree with a lot of what Greg said. For me, it's just about, you know, we need to set people up for success.
Mm-hmm.
When they come to Canada, it's important that they succeed. There's nothing worse than leaving something that you're hoping for a better life to get to a place where that life isn't better. It's actually harder. So we need to, like I say, we need to set people up to succeed, just like all Canadians. We need to set up all Canadians to succeed, including those that come to this country. And you know what? We need to be smart about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. How about you, Marco?
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. I hear a lot about setting up people, setting people up to succeed. I hear that from all the parties, from the NDP to the People's Party. They all wanted people to set up people to succeed, but in practice, I think candidates and politicians need to do more. So I thank both of you for joining us, and good luck.
Thank you.
All right. And yes,
thank you.
And Kelly, I really appreciate you kind of joining us today. I think these conversations and being able to have these opportunities to talk with candidates of all backgrounds and all parties is really important. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you, because I think there are, there's narratives out there about every party, and it's important for us to be able to have these spaces where we can just have conversation, and it's not about the divisive narratives that happen. So I really appreciate it. Some interesting conversation. You both have really interesting histories and past, and I'd love to get to know you more in the future. So really appreciate you taking the time, and I'll follow up as soon as I have the link of this live and ready to go.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marco.
Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.